The last night the power held, I stood at the back door of that clinic and listened to the generator out in the dark run its cycle, the diesel knock, the governor settling, and then the thing it had started doing 3 nights before. The thing no generator on earth is built to do. It counted, slow and even, under the engine noise. A sound like a man ticking off names on his fingers. 1, 2, 3, a long pause, and then starting over. And I stood there with the screen door open and the whole flat, black Panhandle night pressing in on that one lit building. And I understood finally that the generator wasn't counting the hours it had run or the fuel it had left. It was counting us. And it had started 3 nights ago at a number that was too high. And every night, the number came down by 1. You have to understand where I was, because the where is most of it. I was the only nurse at a rural health clinic outside a town too small to name on most maps. Out in the Texas Panhandle, where the land goes flat and empty to the curve of the earth. And the nearest hospital with a real ER was 90 miles of 2-lane blacktop away. Not a hospital, understand. A clinic. A cinder block box with an exam room, a little urgent care bay, a supply room, a lab fridge, and me. A doctor drove out twice a week. Otherwise it was me, an RN running a clinic the way a lighthouse keeper runs a light alone, at the edge of everything, the last help before a whole lot of nothing. In weather, in the dead of night, when a man rolled his truck out on the ranch roads, or a kid spiked a fever at 3 a.m., or an old rancher's heart started skipping, the light they drove toward was my light, and I was what they got when they got there. My name is Garrett Voss, and I ran that clinic for 2 years before the week I'm going to tell you about. And I was good at it, and that's not me bragging, that's me confessing. Because being good at it, believing I was the one who fixed things, believing there wasn't a situation out there I couldn't stabilize and hold and manage until the helicopter came. That belief is what nearly got everyone killed. And it's the flaw I have to lay on the table before any of the rest of it makes sense. I'm going to tell it straight, in order, and you can decide at the end whether I saw something real out in that dark, or whether a proud man alone at the edge of the world finally cracked. I've decided, but you decide for yourself. Let me start with the storm, because the storm is what cut us off, and everything else came in through the cut. It was March, and the Panhandle in March can turn on you a blue sky afternoon into a wall of weather by dark, the kind that drops the temperature 40 degrees in an hour and throws ice and wind across 100 flat miles with nothing to slow it down. This one came in from the northwest, a real one, and by full dark the wind was screaming across the clinic roof and the ice was coming sideways, and the power went at the whole grid, the whole county, the lines down somewhere out in the dark. And the generator kicked on the way it was built to, and the clinic's lights flickered and came back on generator power. And I thought, fine, this is the job, this is what the generator is for, ride it out. The phones went with the power. Cell service out there was 1 bar on a good day, and the storm took even that. The landline was down with the grid. So by 9 o'clock that first night, I was cut off, no power, but the generator, no phone, no way to call the doctor or the hospital or anyone. 90 miles from the nearest real help, in a cinder block box in the middle of a screaming white dark. And that's the situation I need you to hold in your mind, because it's the situation the whole week happened inside of. Alone, cut off, the last light on. And I had patience. That's the part people don't think about with a rural clinic in a disaster you don't get to close. There were 3 people in that clinic when the storm cut us off. There was an old rancher named Alton Petrie, who'd come in that afternoon with chest pain. And I'd gotten him stable and was watching him, waiting for the weather to clear enough to fly him to Amarillo. And now the weather wasn't going to clear, and there was no flying anybody anywhere. There was a young woman named Cheyenne who'd come in with her little boy, 4 years old, a bad croup, and she'd stayed when the storm hit because there was no driving home in it. And there was a man I didn't know, a trucker who'd jackknifed his rig on the ice, out on the highway, and walked the last half-mile to my light with a gash on his head and a bad ankle, he said his name was Dell, and I never learned more than that. So, 3 patients, 1 4-year-old, and me. 6 people, if you count the boy separate from his mother, which you should. And I want you to count them, because the generator did. I didn't notice the counting the first night. The first night I was too busy running the clinic on generator power, managing Alton's heart, keeping the boy's airway open with the croup, cleaning and stitching Dell's head, checking the fuel on the generator, doing the 90 things one nurse does when he's suddenly the whole medical system for 6 people in a blackout. The first night, the generator was just the generator, running out back in its little shed, doing its job. And I blessed it every time I heard it knock, because it was the only thing standing between us and the cold and the dark. The counting started the second night, and the first thing I told myself was that I was hearing things, because I'd been up 30-some hours, and a tired man alone in a storm hears things in an engine the way you hear voices in a fan. That's the first thing I swallowed. And I've learned since that when you're the one that everyone's depending on, the first thing you swallow isn't cowardice, it's management. You file the impossible thing away so you can keep functioning. And you tell yourself you'll deal with it when things calm down. And things never calm down. And the filed away thing sits there working on you. I need to tell you about the generator itself, because the generator is the center of this. And it was old, and it was strange even before it started counting. It was a big diesel standby unit, older than the clinic's last remodel, out in a block shed maybe 40 feet behind the back door, across a stretch of open ground. The clinic had inherited it from the county when the county upgraded. And there was a story about it that I'd heard my first week and forgotten, that it had come out of the old county hospital, the one that closed in the 80s. The one out on the far edge of town that had been a poor farm infirmary before it was a hospital, back in the Dust Bowl days when the Panhandle emptied out and people died of the dust and the hunger and the despair faster than anyone could count them. The generator had run that old infirmary. It had kept the lights on in a building where, in the worst years, they'd run out of room for the dying and stacked them in the halls. And the one thing that place had needed, more than medicine it didn't have, was a way to keep count of the sick, of the dead, of who was still breathing when the nurse came down the row in the morning. That was the story, half remembered, that I hadn't thought about in 2 years. And I want you to hold it, because it came back to me later, out in that shed, in the worst way. The point is, the generator was old, and it had run a place of counting and dying before it ever came to me. And machines from places like that, I've come to believe this now, and I'd have laughed at it before machines carry the work they did. They get the habit of the place worn into them. And this one's habit, from a hospital in the Dust Bowl that couldn't keep up with its own dying, was counting the ones who were left. The second night, around 2 in the morning, I went out to the shed to check the fuel, fighting through the wind and the ice across that 40 feet of open ground. And I stood in the shed with the diesel roaring, and I heard it under the engine noise, clear once I was close. The count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A pause. And then again, from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. There were 6 of us in that clinic. Me, Alton, Cheyenne, the boy Dell, and I counted us in my head, standing in that shed. And I got 6. And the generator was counting to 6 and starting over, slow and even, in a sound that was almost the diesel and almost a voice and was neither. And I stood there in the roar and the cold and told myself, a tired man hears rhythm in an engine. That's all this is. And I checked the fuel. We had plenty. It had a big tank. And I went back across the open ground to the clinic, and I did not write it down. And I did not say a word to anyone. Because I was the one holding it all together, and a man who's holding it all together does not go tell his patients. The generator is counting them. I have to tell you what happened on the third night, because it's the thing that took the counting out of the realm of a tired man's ear and made it a fact. And it's the thing I've never been able to explain away, no matter how hard my rational mind has tried. And I have tried for a long time. On the third night, the count changed. I went out to check the fuel again. I'd started checking it obsessively, I'll admit, because the count had gotten into me even though I wouldn't say so. And I stood in the shed and listened. And it went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pause. From the top. 5, not 6. 5. The count had come down by 1. And I stood there in the roaring cold and did the arithmetic I did not want to do. And I ran back across the open ground to the clinic, and I went to the urgent care bay where I'd had Alton Petrie, the old rancher with the chest pain, on the monitor. Alton was dead. I want to be careful and clinical about this, because it's the only way I can tell it. He'd been stable. His rhythm had been holding. I checked him at midnight, and he was sleeping. Vitals fine. And it was maybe 2:30 now. And he was dead. And he'd been dead, I could tell, from the cooling, from the settling. He'd been dead a while. And I ran the code. I did everything. I worked that old man for a long time, in a clinic with no phone and no backup, and no way to call anyone. And I could not bring him back. And finally I stopped, because a nurse learns when to stop. And I covered him. And I stood there in the generator-lit bay with my hands shaking. And here's the thing. Here is the thing I checked. Because some cold part of me had to know. I noted the time. And then I went back out to the shed through the storm, and I listened to the count. 5. And I understood that the count had dropped to 5 before I found Alton dead. The generator had counted 5 while there were still, as far as I knew, 6 of us. It hadn't counted him after he died. It had counted him out first. It knew before I did. It had counted down to 5, and then, when I went and looked, there were 5. And that is when I stopped being able to manage it, and started being afraid of it, and started, God help me, thinking I could figure it out and beat it, which is the pride, which is the flaw, which is what I have to confess. Let me tell you what the counting was, because I worked it out over the next 2 nights, and it's the shape of the whole thing. The generator counted the living. That was its habit, its worn-in work from the old infirmary to count the ones still breathing, down the row in the dark, when nobody else could keep up with the dying. But out here, cut off in the storm, it wasn't just counting. It was counting down. Every night the number dropped by 1, and every time it dropped, one of us was dead, and the generator knew first. It counted the death before the death happened, or at the moment it happened, out in its shed, in the roar and the cold, ticking us off one at a time. It wasn't causing the deaths. I want to be clear about what I believe and what I don't. I don't think the generator killed Alton Petrie. Alton Petrie was an old man with a bad heart in a blackout 90 miles from a cath lab. I think the generator knew. I think whatever was worn into that machine from a place that spent its whole existence counting the dying could feel the dying coming, the way that old infirmary's night nurse must have learned to feel it coming down the row. And it counted because counting was the only thing that place ever had to offer its dead, to be counted, to be known, to not slip out of the world unnumbered in the dark. That's the part that took me longest and hurts the most. The generator wasn't a monster. It was a machine full of the habit of a place that couldn't save anyone, that could only count them, so that at least somebody knew how many were lost. And now it was doing the only thing it knew how to do. Out in the storm, at the edge of the world, with 6 people cut off from all help, it was keeping the count. Because if it didn't, who would? 90 miles from anywhere, no phone, no power, a nurse alone. If we died out here, one by one, in the blackout, we'd die unnumbered, unknown, the way the Dust Bowl dead died. And the generator, in its terrible way, was refusing to let that happen. It was counting us. It was making sure that however many of us the storm and the dark and our own failing bodies took, somebody, something, kept the count. But understanding that didn't help, because here's the thing that came clear on the 4th night and turned my blood to water. The count wasn't just a record. It was a prediction, and more than a prediction. Because on the 4th night I went out and the count read 4. Alton gone brought us to 5 living, but the count said 4, and I ran back in and everyone was alive. All 5 of us. The boy sleeping, Cheyenne dozing, Dell awake and hurting but fine, and me. 5 living. Count of 4. The generator was counting one of us out before it happened. It had already ticked one of the 5 of us off. One of us, in the next stretch of dark, was going to die. And the generator already knew which, because a machine that counts down the row, knows who's next. And it had dropped its count to 4 while 5 of us still breathed. Which meant it was saying, plain as an old night nurse saying it under her breath, one of these 5 won't see morning. I've already stopped counting them. And I decided, with all the pride of a man who's never met a situation he couldn't stabilize, that I was going to find out which one, and I was going to save them, and I was going to beat the count. That was the mistake. Not going out to the shed, not listening. The mistake was believing I could beat it, believing that because I was good, because I was the one who fixes things, I could look at a machine counting down the dying and reach in and change the number by being better than the dark. Because in trying to beat the count, in deciding I was the one who'd override it, I very nearly became the reason it dropped again, and I nearly killed the one it hadn't counted at all. I want to be honest about the 4th night, because it's where my flaw stopped being a character trait and became a danger to everyone in that building. Count of 4, 5 living, one of us marked. And I did what a proud man does. I decided I'd out-nurse it. I triaged the 5 of us like it was my ICU. Me, healthy, cross me off, I'm not the one. Dell, the trucker, head wound stitched, ankle bad but stable, alert, not the one. Cheyenne, the mother, exhausted but healthy, not the one. Which left the 2 vulnerable ones. The old rancher was already gone, so the count wasn't him, which left the boy with the croup, and I stopped, because there were only the 2 truly fragile ones, and one was dead. So the marked one, the one the generator had counted out, had to be the boy, the 4-year-old, Cheyenne's son. So I poured everything into that boy. I moved him to the urgent care bay. I set up on him like he was crashing. I ran humidified oxygen. I dosed him. I sat over that child all night watching his little chest rise and fall, certain that he was the 4, that he was the one the count had dropped, and that if I just stayed good enough, watchful enough, if I just managed it hard enough, I'd beat the machine and keep the count at 5 and prove that a proud nurse at the edge of the world was stronger than whatever the dark and an old generator thought they knew. And while I was pouring everything into that boy, while I had all my attention, all my equipment, all my watchfulness aimed at the child I'd decided was the marked one. Dell, the trucker, the man I'd crossed off, the man I'd triaged as stable and alert and not the one, was dying in the exam room across the hall, quietly, from something I'd missed. And I didn't see it, because I was so sure I already knew who the 4 was, so sure my judgment had beaten the count, that I'd stopped watching the man the count had actually meant. That's where I have to stop the first part of this. On the 4th night, over the wrong bed, certain I was winning, with the count reading 4 and the man I'd dismissed going cold across the hall, because what happened next is the thing I've never told a soul, the thing that broke my pride in half. And I need to tell it slow and get it exactly right. I found Dell at 4:40 in the morning, and I found him because the generator changed its count, not because I was watching him. And I have to sit in that shame for a second before I go on, because it's the whole hinge of what I am. I was in the urgent care bay with the boy, congratulating myself in the back of my mind. A nurse can congratulate himself and work at the same time. That's a skill and a sickness. Both congratulating myself that the child's oxygen was holding, that his color was good, that I'd found the marked one, and I was holding the line at 5. When I heard the generator's cycle shift out in the shed. You get to know an engine sound when you've been listening to it for 4 days, like your life depends on it. Which mine did. The knock changed. The count changed. And even from inside the building, even under the storm, I heard it drop. I left the boy, left him, because his mother was there. And he was stable. And something in the change of that engine went through me like ice water. And I went across the hall to the exam room, where I'd put Dell. And Dell was gray. Dell was not alert and stable and not the one. Dell was in the last minutes of it, his lips going blue, his breathing gone shallow and ragged. And I got my hands on him. And I understood in about 4 seconds what I'd missed. The truck wreck, the jackknife on the ice. He'd walked half a mile to my light with a head gash and a bad ankle, and I'd stitched the gash and wrapped the ankle, and I'd been so pleased with how I'd handled the obvious injuries that I had not done the thing you do with anyone who's been in a high-speed wreck, which is assume there's something inside you can't see. He'd been bleeding internally the whole time. Slow, for 3 days. And I'd crossed him off. I'd triaged a man with a concealed abdominal bleed as stable because his visible wounds were tidy, and I'd sewn them up nicely. And I'd spent the night that might have saved him hovering over a child who wasn't dying. I worked Dell. I want that on the record. I worked him the way I'd worked Alton, with everything a cinderblock clinic has, which is not enough for an internal bleed 90 miles from a surgeon. And I lost him at 5:15 in the morning, on the 4th night. And I stood there over the body of a man whose name I never fully learned, who'd walked to my light for help, and gotten a proud man who was too busy being right to look at him. And the generator out in the shed settled into its new cycle, and I did not have to go out and listen to know what it read now. 4. It read 4. Alton and Dell both gone. 4 of us left living. Me, Cheyenne, the boy, and the count. And here's the thing that broke me, standing over Dell in the gray hour. The count had said 4, while 5 of us were alive. I'd assumed the 4 meant the boy was next, and I'd been wrong. It had meant Dell, and I'd spent my vigilance on the wrong bed. But the count didn't mean 4 will survive. I'd had the whole logic backward in my pride. The count wasn't a promise of how many would live. It was just the number the machine had reached, and it was still dropping. It had gone 6, 5, 4. It had not stopped. It was counting down, towards some number. And the number it was counting toward, I understood with the cold certainty of a man who has just watched his own arrogance kill somebody, was not 4, and it was not 1. It was 0. The generator was counting us to 0. That was the shape of the whole week. That was what the storm and the dark and the cutoff were for 6 of us. Cut off from all help, 90 miles from anywhere, and a machine that counted the dying, counting down, 1 a night, toward none of us left. It wasn't marking 1 victim. It was working through the row. And I'd wasted the 4th night, proving I could beat a count I hadn't even understood. And a man had died in the next room while I did it. I need to tell you what I did next, because it's the part where my pride, having just gotten a man killed, tried to reassert itself one more time. And I nearly let it, and it would have finished us. Because a proud man, faced with proof that his judgment is fatal, does not usually become humble. He doubles down. He tells himself the last failure was a fluke, a missed detail, a fixable error, and that now he's got it. Now he really understands. Now he'll beat it for sure. And that's exactly what I did, standing over Dell. I told myself I was wrong about the boy because I triaged on visible injury. But now I understand the count is going to 0. And now I can get ahead of it. I've got 3 people left besides the count. Me, Cheyenne, the boy. And the count is going to come for one of us tonight, on the 5th night. And I am going to figure out which, and I am going to stop it. I was already over the body of the man my certainty had killed, building a new certainty. And the new certainty was this, and I'm ashamed of it. I decided the count would come for the boy next. Again. Because he was the frailest, the croup, the 4-year-old. And because this is the ugly part, the pride part, because I could not stand the idea that the count might come for me. I was the nurse. I was the one who fixes things. I was the healthy one, the competent one, the one holding it all together. My whole identity was that I was not a patient. I was the one who had patience. So of course, in my triage, I put myself last, safest, uncountable. And I put the boy first to be lost. And I began, on the 5th day, to do the exact same thing I'd done on the 4th. I began to pour all my attention onto the child, certain again, arranging my whole vigil around a conclusion I'd reached because it protected my image of myself. What stopped me was Cheyenne. And I have to give her this, because she saw the thing I couldn't see, being the one blinded by it. She'd been watching me. A mother watches. She'd watched me lose 2 men, and she'd watched me go straight back to hovering over her son with a look on my face she didn't like. And on the 5th morning, gray and exhausted, with the storm still screaming and 2 bodies covered in the back and the generator knocking out its 4 in the shed, she said to me, quiet, over the top of her sleeping boy, "You keep looking at him like he's already dying. He's not dying. His breathing's better than it was the first night. You fixed his croup. He's the healthiest one in this building except you." And then she said the thing that took the floor out from under me. "You keep working on him because you can't stand to just sit still and be scared like the rest of us. You need somebody to be saving. That's not about him. That's about you." I want to tell you I argued. I didn't. I stood there in the gray light with her words going through me, because they were true. And I knew they were true the way you know a thing you've spent years not knowing. I had spent that whole week, that whole career, needing someone to be saving. Because being the one who saves was the only way I knew how to be in a room where people were suffering. I couldn't just be present. I couldn't just be one frightened person among frightened people. I had to be the one in charge, the one with the answer, the one who fixes it, and that need, that pride dressed up as competence, had made me useless when it mattered, because a man who needs to be the savior stops being able to see. He sees the role, not the room. He'd sewn up a dying man's forehead beautifully and never checked his belly. He was smothering a healthy child with care to feed his own need to matter. And in the quiet, after Cheyenne said it, I finally looked at the Count honestly instead of through my pride. And I saw the thing I'd been refusing to see. And it was the worst thing yet. The Count read 4. 4 living. Me, Cheyenne, the boy, and no. I counted again. Me, Cheyenne, the boy. That was 3. 3 living people in the clinic. The Count read 4. I went out to the shed. I fought across the open ground through the ice, and I stood in the roar, and I listened. And it was 4. Clear. 1, 2, 3, 4. From the top, 4. And I came back in, and I counted the living again with my hands actually touching them. Cheyenne, warm, alive. The boy, warm, breathing, alive. Me, alive 3. The count was 1 higher than the number of us left. And I understood, and it dropped my stomach through the floor. The count wasn't counting the living. It never had been. Not exactly. It was counting everyone the storm had gathered under that light, who hadn't yet been let go. 6, when Alton and Dell were still dying but not dead. And now 4, when only 3 of us breathed, because there was a 4th in that building who was dead but not counted out, not released, not accounted for, still held under the light in the dark, waiting to be numbered. And I realized, standing there, that I had never actually confirmed Alton's death the way you're supposed to when you're the only nurse, and there's no doctor and no morgue and no one to call. I had worked him, and stopped and covered him, and moved on to the next crisis, and I had never done the last thing, the thing the old infirmary nurse would have known to do, the thing the whole point of the count was. I had never gone back and formally, deliberately, with my full attention, counted him among the dead. I had left him uncounted, covered but unnumbered, in the dark, the way the Dust Bowl dead were left, stacked in the halls, unnumbered. And that was the thing the generator could not bear. That was the whole habit worn into it. It could not let a death go uncounted. And if the living wouldn't count the dead, it would keep counting them itself, holding them on the tally, 1, 2, 3, 4, refusing to drop the number, refusing to let a soul slip out of the world, unnumbered in the dark, and it would keep counting down, through the living toward the dead, until somebody, finally, kept the count right. The generator wasn't counting us down to kill us. I'd had that backward too, the way I had everything backward that week. In my pride. It was counting because I wasn't. Because the one job that machine had, the one terrible mercy of the place it came from, was to make sure the dead were counted. And I, the nurse, the one who's supposed to keep the record, mark the time, name the dead, do the last office for the ones who die on your shift. I had been so busy trying to save the living and be the hero that I had left my dead uncounted. Alton, covered and forgotten in the crisis. Dell, whose name I never learned, whose people didn't know where he was, who'd die out here unnumbered and unknown unless somebody kept the count. The generator was doing my job. It was keeping the count I'd failed to keep. And it would not stop. It could not stop. Until the count was made right, until the dead were properly numbered by the living. Named, timed, accounted for, let go into the light of being known instead of left in the dark of being forgotten. I want to be honest about the hour that followed, because it's the only hour of that whole week I'm not ashamed of. And it's the hour my pride finally died, which had to happen before anyone could be saved. I stopped nursing. That's the thing. For 4 days I'd been nursing, managing, fixing, triaging, hovering, being the one in charge. And it had killed a man, and nearly killed a child through neglect by obsession. And I finally understood that what this situation needed from me was not the savior. It needed the other half of the job, the half a proud man skips, because it doesn't make him feel heroic. The keeping of the dead, the witnessing, the count. So I went to Alton Petrie, and instead of a covered shape I'd hurried past for 2 days, I uncovered him, and I looked at him, this old rancher who'd driven to my light with a pain in his chest, trusting that I'd be enough. And I did the last office. I noted the time of death as best I could reconstruct it, and I wrote it down, in the clinic log, in ink. His name, Alton Petrie, the date, the time, deceased, the cause as best I could judge it. I counted him. I said his name out loud in that generator-lit room, which felt insane and was the sanest thing I did all week. And I did the same for Dell, and here I did the thing that mattered most, because Dell had almost nothing, no ID I'd found. A man who'd have vanished off the face of the earth in that storm. I went through his pockets, properly this time, with respect instead of triage speed. And I found a wallet in an inside coat pocket I'd never checked. And his name was Dell Hardaway. And there was a photo of 2 kids and an address in Oklahoma. And I wrote all of it down, his real name, his people, where he was from, so that whatever happened to the rest of us, this man would be counted, would be known, would not be one more unnumbered body in the Panhandle dark. And as I wrote Dell Hardaway's name in the log, the moment the pen finished it, the generator out in the shed changed its cycle. I heard it from inside. The count dropped, not down toward 0. It went from 4 to 3. And I understood. It had been holding 4 because there were 2 uncounted dead among us, Alton and Dell, Plusno. It had held 4 for 2 uncounted dead, and I'd just counted them both, which should have brought it to. I ran the arithmetic, frantic, in the log room. 3 living, 2 dead, now counted. If the count only holds the uncounted, and I'd just counted both dead, it should read 3, the 3 living. And it did. It dropped to 3 and held. 3, the number of us actually alive. For the first time in 4 nights, the count matched the living, because the dead were finally counted, finally numbered, finally let go from the tally into the record, into the light of being known. The generator wasn't counting us down anymore. It had never wanted to reach 0. It had wanted to reach true. It had wanted the count to be right for the number it kept to match the number of souls actually under that light. Living counted as living and dead counted as dead. Nobody held in the terrible in-between. Nobody uncounted in the dark. And the only thing keeping the count wrong, the only thing driving it down and down toward a 0 that terrified me, was that I, the keeper of the count, the nurse, had refused to count my dead. My pride had literally been the malfunction. As long as I needed to be the savior and couldn't bear to turn from the living to number the dead, the count stayed wrong, and the machine kept grinding down toward the only number that would eventually be true if I never did my job. 0, when we were all dead and all, at last, equally uncounted. But it wasn't over. And this is the part where my pride made its last, worst stand, and where I nearly killed the one person the count had never marked. Because here's what I got wrong even then, even in my humility, even holding Dell Hardaway's wallet. I thought the danger was past. Count matched the living. 3, I thought I'd fixed it, and do you see it? Even my humility had curdled back into pride, because I thought I'd fixed it. I'd figured out the rule and done the office and said it right. Savior again. Just a quieter kind. And I relaxed. On the 5th night, with the count reading a true 3, I let myself believe we'd ride out the storm now, that the deaths were behind us, that I'd solved the generator like a puzzle, and we 3 would live. And that complacency almost killed Cheyenne. Because the storm was still going and we were still cut off, and we were still 3 living people in a cinder block box 90 miles from help. And one of us, Cheyenne, had been on her feet for 5 days, running on nothing. Caring for a sick child, watching a nurse lose 2 men. And she was, though I hadn't looked, because I never looked at the healthy ones. That was my whole disease. She was not fine. Sometime in the 5th night, while I sat satisfied that I'd solved the count, Cheyenne collapsed. A clot. Most likely, she'd been dehydrated and immobile and stressed and terrified for days, all the risk factors. And I hadn't been watching her because I'd triaged her days ago as the healthy mother, not the one, uncountable, the same fatal shortcut I'd used on Dell, and she went down in the exam room with her son asleep beside her. And I found her not because I was watching, but because the boy woke and cried out. And I ran in, and she was seizing, going, the count about to drop to 2. And this time, there was no generator counting ahead to warn me, because the count was true now. It wasn't predicting anymore. It was just keeping the number honest. And the number was about to become honestly, truly 2. And I had done it again. I had let a person die of my certainty that I already knew who was safe. Except this time I caught it. Barely. Because Cheyenne's own words were in my head, you need somebody to be saving. That's about you. And in the half-second I stood frozen over her seizing body, the old reflex fired. The savior reflex. The part of me that wanted to make this a heroic solo rescue. The nurse against the storm. One more chance to be the one who fixes it. And I overrode it. For the first time in my life, over that dying woman, I overrode the need to be the hero. And I did the humble thing, the unproud thing, the thing that cost me my whole self-image and saved her life. I woke the child, and I got on my knees. And I did not try to do it all alone. But that's where the second part of this has to end, on my knees, on the 5th night, a woman dying under my hands. Her 4-year-old awake and terrified beside me, the storm still screaming, the generator knocking out a count that was true and about to become truer, and me final null understanding that the only way any of us got out of that dark alive was for me to stop being the one who saves and become one frightened, ordinary person among others, doing what could be done, together, with no hero in the room. Because the third part is the part where I found out what that costs a proud man, and whether it was enough, and what I carried out of that clinic when the sky finally cleared. And I need to tell it slow and get it exactly right. I want to tell you exactly what I did on my knees on the 5th night, because it was the smallest thing and the hardest thing, and it is the hinge the whole week turns on. Cheyenne was seizing, and then she stopped seizing, which is worse, and her breathing went shallow and wet and wrong. And I knew with the one part of my competence that was ever actually worth anything, the cold clinical part, that this was almost certainly a clot thrown to her lungs. I knew that in a real hospital, there were things you do for that. Drugs and machines and a surgeon down the hall. And I knew that in a cinder block clinic 90 miles from the nearest of any of it, with no phone and no doctor and a storm still screaming, there was almost nothing I could do that would change the ending. And the old me, the proud me, would have spent the next hour doing all of it anyway. Every heroic, useless intervention in the book. Not because it would help, because when she died, I wanted to be able to tell myself I'd done everything. so that the story would be the nurse fought the storm and lost. That is a story with a hero in it, even when the hero fails. That is the story I'd been telling about myself my whole life. And it had already killed a man that week. And I was about to tell it one more time over a dying mother while her child watched. I didn't. I did the other thing. I turned to the boy, 4 years old, awake now, crying, terrified. The child I had smothered with unnecessary care for 4 days to feed my own hunger to be saving somebody. And I stopped treating him like a patient to be managed and started treating him like what he actually was, which was a person who loved his mother more than anyone else in that building did, more than I ever could. I got down to his level and I said, "Your mom is very sick and I need your help. This is a real job and it's yours. I need you to hold her hand and I need you to talk to her and tell her you're right here. Don't stop. That's the most important job in this room. Can you do that for me?" And that little boy stopped crying, the way a child will when you give him something to do inside a terror. And he took his mother's hand in both of his, and he put his face down close to hers. And he started to talk, 4-year-old talk. "Mama, Mama, I'm here. Wake up, Mama. Mama, it's me." Over and over. No sense to it. Just his voice and her name and his hands around hers. And I did the medicine I could actually do. I positioned her to help her breathe. I got oxygen on her. I did the handful of small, real things that might buy minutes. And I did them well, because the clinical skill was still there and still mine. But I did them as one person helping in a room full of fear, not as the hero of the story. And I let the boy's voice be the thing she came back toward. If she was going to come back toward anything at all. She came back toward him, not toward me. I have to be honest about that because it is the whole splitting open of everything I believed about myself. Her breathing caught and steadied, ragged and shallow, but there. And it steadied while the 4-year-old said, "Mama, I'm here," into her ear. And my medicine kept her body alive, long enough for that voice to reach wherever she'd gone. But it was the voice that did the reaching. I had spent an entire career believing I was the thing that stood between people and death, the indispensable one, the light in the dark. And on the worst night of my life, I watched a preschooler do the part that mattered most. And I understood that I was, at very best, one thing among several in that room, and not the most important thing. And that the greatest danger a proud man carries into a sick room is that he will shove aside the small, quiet person whose held hand is actually keeping the patient tethered to the world, because that person's contribution doesn't flatter the nurse, doesn't fit the story where he's the hero. She didn't die that night. I want to be careful not to dress it up as a miracle, because it wasn't. It was a woman with a partial clot and a strong heart and a reason to live, holding on by her fingernails until dawn, and it was touch and go until the gray came up in the windows. But she didn't die. The count did not drop to 2. It held at 3 all night, 3 living, honestly and truly 3. And I sat on the floor between the mother and the boy through the last black hours of that storm. And I did not once go out to the shed to check the count. And I want you to understand why. Because it's the measure of how far I'd finally come. I didn't need the machine to tell me who was alive anymore. I could count them myself. Cheyenne, breathing. The boy, awake, holding on. Me, 3. That was my job. It had always been my job. Both halves of it keep the living and keep the count of the dead. And I had only ever wanted the half, with glory in it. The storm broke on the 6th morning, and it broke the way Panhandle storms break, which is all at once and total. The wind, which had been a physical pressure on that building for 5 days. A thing you leaned against and shouted over and stopped hearing, the way you stop hearing your own blood. The wind just stopped. Sometime in the last dark before dawn, it quit. And when the light came up, it came up on a world I have never seen the equal of before or since. Everything glazed. Every fence wire, every dead stalk of grass, every blade and post and blown weed sheathed in a 1/4 inch of clear ice, and the sun coming up flat across all of it, 100 miles of it out to the round edge of the earth. Blinding, silent, so still and so bright it hurt to look at, like the whole Panhandle had been dipped in glass overnight and hung up to catch the light. And in that enormous new silence, the generator ran down. Not broke, ran down. It had a big tank, but not a bottomless one. And 6 days is 6 days. And sometime in that bright, still morning, the last of the diesel finally went. I heard the knock slow. I heard the governor lose its grip and the rhythm stagger. The clinic lights, which had been generator yellow for 6 days, flickered and browned. And I went out the back door and across the open ground, which was a sheet of glass now, the ice crunching and cracking under my boots. The loudest thing in a silence so complete, it rang. And I stood in the doorway of the shed and watched the old machine turn over its last. And I heard the count one final time. It was slow now, winding down with the dying engine, the strange undersound stretching out and going soft. 1. A long pause, longer than the fuel-starved engine needed. 2. Another pause. 3. And then it stopped. It did not go to 2. It did not count anyone down toward the 0 it had been grinding toward all week when the count was wrong and I was too proud to fix it. It reached 3, the 3 of us living, true and whole and honest, and it held there. And then the engine died underneath it. One last knock and a long descending sigh of moving metal coming to rest, and the count died with it. On 3. Correct. Complete. Nobody uncounted. Nobody in the dark. I stood in that shed with the dead machine ticking and pinging as it cooled. And I finally understood the whole of it. The thing my pride had blinded me to for 6 days. The generator had never wanted to reach 0. It had never been a thing that killed. It had come out of a place, the old poor farm infirmary, the Dust Bowl years, a building where they ran out of room for the dying and stacked them in the halls and could not, for all their trying, save more than a fraction of them, a place whose one remaining mercy, when medicine failed, and it failed constantly, was to count the dead, to number them, to make sure that in all that dust and hunger and anonymous mass dying, each person who went out of the world went out counted, known to have existed, their death witnessed and recorded by someone, even if all that someone could do was write the number down. That was the sacred work of that place, worn so deep into 90 years of that machine's iron that when it found itself out at the edge of the world again, 6 people cut off from all help in a killing storm, it did the only thing it had ever really known how to do. It kept the count. And the count had gone wrong, had driven downward towards 0 for one reason and one reason only. Because I, the keeper of the count, the nurse, the person whose actual job it is, to note the time and name the dead, and do the last office for those who die on your watch, had refused to do it. I had been so busy being the savior, so hungry to be the one who fixes things, that I had left my dead uncounted. Alton covered and hurried past in the rush to the next crisis. Dell dying unwatched across the hall while I hovered over a healthy child. The machine could not bear an uncounted death. It was built out of the refusal to allow one. And as long as I left souls unnumbered under that light, the count stayed broken, and it ground downward, because the only number that becomes true if the dead are never counted is 0. when everyone is dead and everyone is equally, finally, forgotten. My pride had been the malfunction, not the storm, not the machine, me. The count came right the instant I stopped needing to be the hero and did the humble half of my work, knelt down and named Alton Petrie in the log, went through Del Hardaway's pockets with respect instead of triage speed, and found his name and his children and his town, said them out loud, counted my dead. The number matched the living the moment the dead were properly numbered. And then, when the storm passed and the fuel ran out and there was nothing left uncounted, the machine let go. It held at 3 and it stopped. Its work was done. I have never heard the count since, and I never will. And I understood standing in that shed that I was hearing the last of a mercy that had run for 90 years and was finally, at long last, permitted to rest. The grid came back that afternoon. A county crew working the downed lines got the power up, and the phones came with it. And the moment I had a dial tone, I called for everything. And by evening, the sky was clear enough to fly, and there was a helicopter and paramedics and sheriff's deputies and all the machinery of the reachable world descending on my little light, now that the world could reach it again. They flew Cheyenne to Amarillo. And she lived, I need to say that plainly, and let it stand. Because so much of this account is failure. And I won't hide the one thing that went right. The clot was managed by real specialists with real equipment, and she recovered. And her boy rode in the helicopter with her, holding her hand the entire flight, still doing the job I'd given him on the clinic floor. And I've thought since that I gave that child the one useful thing I gave anyone that week. And that even that was really me finally getting out of the way and letting him do what love was already trying to do. And they took the dead. Alton Petrie, an old rancher who had driven to my light with a pain in his chest, trusting I'd be enough. And I hadn't been. And there was no shame I could take on that would change it, because sometimes an old heart in a blackout 90 miles from a cath lab is simply going to stop. But he went out counted, named, his time recorded, not a covered shape hurried past. And Del Hardaway, who I want to tell you about one more time, because he is the center of what I learned, walked half a mile through a jackknife wreck and a screaming storm to reach my light. And I sewed up his forehead beautifully and wrapped his ankle and felt proud of my tidy work. And never once checked his belly, where he was bleeding to death slowly the whole time. And he died of my pride as surely as of the wreck. But when it was done, when I finally cracked and did the office, I went through his coat with attention and found the wallet in the inside pocket I'd never checked. And his name was there, and a photo of 2 kids, and an address in Oklahoma, and so a man who would otherwise have been an unidentified body found in the melt of a Panhandle blizzard, a nobody, a blank, went home to Oklahoma with his name, to 2 children who at least would know where their father died, and that he had not simply vanished off the face of the earth into nothing. I gave him that. It is the only thing I gave him, and I gave it 4 days too late to save him. And I counted anyway, because the alternative was to let him go uncounted into the dark. And I finally understood that letting that happen is the one unforgivable thing in my line of work. The sheriff's people asked me a great many questions, the way they do when 2 people die at a clinic during a disaster. And I answered them all honestly but one. I told them about the storm and the cutoff and the failed phones. I told them, made sure it was on the record, said it plainly, because a proud man's last vanity is hiding his mistakes. And I was finished with all of it. That I had missed a survivable internal bleed on Del Hardaway because I'd been focused on the wrong patient. I put my own failure in the record with my own mouth. The only thing I did not tell them was about the count, about the generator. Because there is no way to say the machine counted us, it counted the dying before they died. It held the uncounted dead on its tally and drove the number toward 0 until I did my job to a deputy with a clipboard, and there was no need to. The count was kept now. That was the only thing that had ever mattered to the machine, and it was done, and it had earned its silence. They wrote up Alton as a cardiac death in a blackout, which he was. They wrote up Dell as a missed traumatic hemorrhage, which he was. And there was a formal review of my care. And I did not fight it, and I did not minimize. And it found what it found, that a nurse working alone and overwhelmed for days in a disaster made a fatal error of omission. And that was true. And I let it be true. Not once did I say, but the machine warned me, and I was too proud to listen, because that would have been asking a generator to carry a weight that was mine and mine alone. I left the clinic within the year, and I want to be precise about why, because it isn't the reason you'd expect. I didn't leave because I was traumatized, though I was, and for a while, I couldn't hear a diesel engine without my chest going tight. I didn't leave because I'd lost my nerve, though there was a stretch where I had. I left because I had finally understood that I'd become a nurse for the wrong reason, and that the wrong reason was lethal, and that until I fixed it in myself, I had no business being the only light for 90 miles in any direction. I had become a nurse to be the one who saves, to matter, to walk into any room and be, immediately and unmistakably, the most important person in it, the one with the answer, the one they turn to, the one who fixes what's broken. And for years, that need had disguised itself as dedication. It had looked like competence. It had, most of the time, even produced good care. Because a man who needs to be the savior works hard and studies hard and stays late. But it was rotten at the center, because it made me unable to see the people I wasn't actively rescuing. It made me unable to turn from the dramatic save to the quiet man dying unnoticed across the hall. It made me unable to let a 4-year-old be the one whose voice reached his mother. It made me unable to simply be present inside suffering without needing to be its hero. And a nurse who needs to be the hero will, on some bad enough night, kill somebody with that need. I had. His name was Del Hardaway. I have his children's faces from a wallet photo in my memory, and I will carry them the rest of my life. So I did the humbling work. I took a job in a big hospital, on a medical floor, one nurse among dozens, where I was nobody's only light, where the doctors were down the hall and the specialists were an elevator ride away, and I was a small, replaceable part of an enormous machine of care, exactly the situation my pride had spent a whole career steering me away from, because there was no solo glory in it, no chance to be the one. And it was the best and most necessary thing I ever did, because there, stripped of the role I'd built my whole identity on, I finally learned the half of the job I'd always skipped. I learned to sit with the dying when there was no saving left to do and no hero's part to play. I learned to be present without needing to fix, to witness without needing to rescue, to hold a hand at the end and note the time and say the name, and do the last office slowly and with attention, instead of hurrying past death toward my next chance to be the savior. I learned that the most sacred thing a nurse does is not the rescue. The rescue is the part that gets the medals and the television shows. The most sacred thing is the count. It is making certain that no one dies unwitnessed, unnamed, unnumbered, slipping out of the world alone in the dark. It is the exact thing the old infirmary could never do enough of in the dust and the dying. The thing that got worn so deep into an iron machine that the machine went on doing it for 90 years after the people who built it were themselves dead and, I hope, counted. I had to lose 2 men to learn it. I would give a great deal to have learned it some cheaper way, There was no cheaper way available to a man as proud as I was. Here is the last of it. The clinic is still out there. Someone else runs it now. And they've got a proper new generator. And I hope with everything in me that it only ever makes electricity. But the old machine, the one from the infirmary, the one that counted the county, hauled it off as scrap when they put in the new one. I heard about it secondhand months later, and I did a strange thing. A thing the proud man I used to be would never have understood the point of. I drove out to the scrapyard where it had gone. 90 miles, and then a good deal more, out past where the towns give up entirely. And I found it, in a field of dead machines under that same enormous flat Panhandle sky. The big old diesel unit, gone to rust now, silent, its tank long dry, sitting among 100 other worn-out engines in the tall dead grass. And I didn't take anything from it. No part, no keepsake, nothing to carry home and set on a shelf, because I understood by then that the machine had never been the point, and the count was never in the iron. The count was in the doing of it. The witnessing was the whole of it. What I did was stand in front of it, in the wind, in that field of the dead. And I said their names out loud. Alton Petrie, Del Hardaway. I counted them one last time, to the one thing in the world that had counted them the week I would not a dead machine in a scrapyard that had done my sacred work for me, when my pride had made me unfit to do it myself. And then I said the third name, the one the count had held at 3 and let walk out into the light. Cheyenne. And her boy's name, which I'll keep to myself. The 4-year-old whose 2 small hands reached his mother across the dark when all my medicine couldn't. 4 names, spoken into the wind, to a rusted-out generator in a field at the edge of the world. Then I turned and walked back to my truck through the dead grass. And I left the machine where it lay, and I did not look back at it. And I drove the long road home in the falling light, with the heater ticking and the flat country going blue on both sides of me and nothing at all in my hands. The count was 3 that morning in the shed. 2 of us had gone out counted, and 1 had walked out living with her son's hand in hers. The machine had held the number until it was true, and then it had let go and stopped and rested. I count them still, all 4, every single day. It's the only part of me I trust now, and I've learned that it's enough.